This is a story about the route taken by the hole-in-the-rock expedition in 1879 to 1880 to settle the San Juan River area in southeastern Utah. Faced with difficult terrain across rugged Slickrock bluffs and canyons, they carved a passage known as the Hole-in-the-Rock through a sandstone cliff across the Colorado River. Previously, Part 1 focused on the portion of the route between Escalante, Utah, and 50 Mile Springs Camp, which turned out to be the easiest portion of the journey. Part 1 is available on my channel if you haven't viewed that part yet. This video, Part 2, will continue from the 50 Mile Springs Camp to the actual Hole-in-the-Rock passage, which leads down to the Colorado River, now Lake Powell. While this portion of the route only covers approximately 10 miles between 50 Mile Spring and the Colorado River, the settlers left behind a relatively easier travel across high desert rangelands and began encountering the rugged Slickrock terrain and bluffs, which, unbeknownst to them at the time, characterized much of the remainder of their full journey. For those of you that have explored the slick rock areas that are very characteristic to south central Utah and haven't been in this area, you'll find that this area is kind of Moab light or a more laid back, relaxed version of Moab. Obviously, the settlers did not have a graded road through these bluffs and canyons in this Slickrock area when they came through in the late 1870s. And I can imagine them taking their wagons over these rocks and trying to navigate the best route through here with all the livestock. I thoroughly enjoy driving Slickrock. I find it one of the most enjoyable off-road environments compared to mud or heavy rock areas or just dry, dusty areas. Slickrock is kind of a misnomer. Your tires really stick very well to this surface, and I enjoy the colors, the distinction between the orange, the whites, the greens, and the vegetation. So this was traveled in early May of 2025, and it actually rained out here several days prior to my visit, which is why you're seeing the occasional water holes that we're driving through. I tried to drive slow through those for two reasons. One, I just washed the Jeep this earlier this morning after traversing other trails, and it was very muddy. And two, I just try not to tear up the trail that much. Even though this is slick rock and it's more rock and less dirt, it can become quite muddy at times. If it feels like we're making much slower progress than we were during part one of this series, You're right. Uh, the first part was through those high rangelands, and they were nicely graded roads. And this last 10 miles, we're meandering through and traversing these bluffs and the Slickrock areas. So I would imagine it was just as slow for the settlers as it is for me. Something to keep in mind as we move through this portion of the video is that the settlers that were involved in this expedition, they were camped out among three different primary campsites: the 40-mile spring area, the 50-mile spring area, both of which I mentioned in part one, and the area right around the hole in the rock passageway. The last part there, most of the people that worked on excavating and blasting that passageway stayed there. But there were settlers that each day they traveled from the 40-mile spring area and the 50-mile spring area to the hole in the rock passage to help with the excavation and the blasting of the rock, while many other of the settlers were tasked with maintaining and keeping the livestock fed and grazed and taken care of throughout the entire time they were out here. So there were people that actually traversed through this area and walked this area or rode by horseback or wagon through this area multiple times while they were out there. Sometimes the trip can become monotonous, and I'm sure it was for these settlers moving at the slower pace they were, especially when they were spending months out here doing this rather than weeks. So I decided to speed up portions of this video so that we can get through the high rangeland grass areas and get back into the slick rock as we approach the hole in rock passage area. Speaking of spending months out here instead of the weeks they originally planned, I find myself thinking, how did they account for their resources? How were they fed? How were they feeding their livestock? Was the weather cold? It was late fall into November, December. So, what we found out through the journals and the diary entries is that many of the citizens of the town of Escalante were actually supporting the expedition quite a bit. I'm sure they were selling a lot of the supplies and the resources to them, but many of the expedition members, they would go back and forth all the way back to Escalante to get more supplies, to get more equipment, to just basically make sure that they had what they need to have to make it through this unexpected delay. Eventually, the leaders of the expedition realized that they needed more resources, and one of the primary leaders decided to travel back to Salt Lake City to request additional funding, additional support services, additional resources from the church to support getting through the hole in the rock passage. That leader never returned to the expedition, but was able to arrange throughout the remainder of the expedition additional supplies, additional picks, axes, blasting equipment, dynamite, whatever they needed to make it through the passageway. And many of those supplies were delivered down to Escalante, and then the expedition settlers would travel up to Escalante and bring them down. So they were very well supported during the time when they encountered these additional delays. As we begin to approach the final segment of this portion of the journey, we have to remind ourselves that we're descending down to the Colorado River Canyon. From this perspective, you would not think there was actually a canyon there. It's until you get to those cliffs and you're able to explore and realize how far down that river is, especially at that time before Lake Powell was dammed up and created. Early scouts identified two possible gaps in which to descend through the cliffs to the river. The southerly gap, which became known as Hole in the Rock, was chosen for several reasons, including what they thought would be the best location to cross the river once they descended down from the higher plateau. The original gap was reportedly a narrow, steep crevice in the canyon rim, which they had to improve and widen to allow for sufficient passage for their wagons and livestock. I use the term sufficient and not safe because lowering the wagons, livestock, and settlers down the almost mile descent proved to be very treacherous. Blasting powder and hand chisels were used to widen the upper section and create anchor points in the sandstone rock. Small diameter poles were inserted into those anchor points, and vertical structures were constructed along those anchor poles so that debris from the blasting would collect between the poles and the natural rock face on each side of the gap. This was done to lessen the steep grade down the natural gap while also minimizing the amount of blasting necessary to widen the floor of the natural gap. In a sense, the settlers basically developed an elevated platform along a portion of the gap to flatten out the descent. Even with that, surviving journal and diary entries describe very scary descents, using ropes to tie up the axles of the wagons, which allowed them to somewhat control the speed of the descent down to the river's edge. Finally, after almost 3 months of effort, on January 26, 1880, the first wagons descended the passage to the Colorado River below. Following are a few photographs of other visitors that came out during the day I was out there. I added these to give you a perspective on how wide that gap is and how tall the rocks are above the passageway. Yes, that gap is only wide enough for a wagon, which was only about 7 or 8 feet wide at that time. It's amazing looking down through that passageway what they encountered. Part 3 will focus on the portion of the route located immediately southeast of the Colorado River, across the Slickrock plateaus and canyons, which the settlers traversed before eventually establishing the settlement in the Four Corners region on the San Juan River, which is known today as Bluff, Utah.